Most visitors to South Africa follow roughly the same route. Land in Cape Town, ride the cable car up Table Mountain, spend a few days on safari watching lions from the safety of a jeep, maybe tour a township with a licensed guide for an hour before heading back to the hotel. It's a genuinely beautiful trip. It's also almost entirely disconnected from how most of the 63 million people who actually live here experience their own country day to day. This is a nation that holds some of the oldest evidence of human existence on the planet, that was legally engineered for nearly half a century to keep its own racial groups apart by force, and that is still, 3 decades after democracy arrived, working through the economic aftershocks of that engineering in ways that show up in almost every statistic you can measure. Start with the map. South Africa sits at the very southern tip of the African continent, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet at Cape Agulhas, the continent's true southernmost point. The country is enormous, roughly twice the size of Texas, larger than France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined, and unusually, it has 3 separate capital cities. Pretoria handles executive government, Cape Town seats parliament, and Bloemfontein hosts the Supreme Court. A deliberate compromise dating back to the country's founding that has simply never been consolidated since. The population sits at roughly 63 to 64 million people, and this is one of the few countries on Earth where the government still officially tracks population by racial category. A direct legacy of the apartheid-era classification system that, even after being formally abolished, remains embedded in national statistics because so much post-apartheid policy, from land reform to affirmative action programs, is explicitly designed to address racial disparities inherited from that system. 12 languages hold official status under the Constitution, including isiZulu, isiXhosa, Afrikaans, and English. More official languages than almost any other country in the world, reflecting a population made up of dozens of distinct ethnic and cultural communities rather than a single unified national culture. That linguistic diversity maps directly onto the country's ethnic composition. Black African communities, including Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, Tswana, and several other distinct groups, make up roughly 81% of the population, each with its own language, historical kingdom or chiefdom structure, and regional identity that predates colonization by centuries. The colored community, a distinct mixed-race population concentrated heavily in the Western Cape, traces its ancestry to a combination of indigenous Khoekhoe people, enslaved populations brought from Southeast Asia and elsewhere in Africa during the Dutch colonial period, and European settlers. Indian and Asian South Africans, concentrated mainly around Durban, trace their roots largely to indentured laborers brought over by British colonial authorities in the 19th century to work sugar plantations in what was then Natal. And the white population, roughly 8% of the country today, split historically between Afrikaner descendants of the original Dutch settlers and English-speaking descendants of later British colonists, 2 European communities that, for much of the 20th century, were themselves intense political competition before eventually uniting behind the apartheid project together. Now, the part almost nobody expects. This land holds some of the most significant human origin sites on Earth. The Cradle of Humankind, a UNESCO World Heritage Site northwest of Johannesburg, has yielded more early human fossils than almost anywhere else on the planet, including specimens dating back over 2 million years, providing crucial evidence supporting the theory that humanity's earliest ancestors originated in Africa. The San people, sometimes called Bushmen, represent one of the oldest continuously surviving populations on Earth, with genetic evidence suggesting their ancestors have lived in southern Africa for at least 100,000 years. Meaning this region has been continuously inhabited by modern humans longer than almost anywhere else on the planet, long before any of the political history that follows even began. Long before European contact, The region was also home to sophisticated Bantu-speaking farming and ironworking societies, who began migrating into southern Africa from further north, roughly 2,000 years ago, gradually establishing the ethnic and linguistic map that still largely defines the country today. By the early 19th century, the Zulu kingdom under leaders like Shaka had built one of the most militarily formidable states in the region, expanding its territory through a period historians call the Mfecane, a series of wars and forced migrations that reshaped the political landscape of southern Africa well before British colonial expansion even reached the interior. That pre-colonial political complexity rarely makes it into outside narratives about the country, which tend to begin the story with Dutch arrival rather than with the sophisticated, competing African societies that were already here. Hold on to that timeline. We will get there. Here is a fact that says more about the last 4 centuries of South African history than almost anything else. Dutch traders established a refreshment station at the Cape in 1652, initially intended as nothing more than a supply stop for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. That small outpost grew into permanent settler colonies, and over the following 2 centuries, conflict between European settlers, indigenous Kwiku and San communities, and expanding African kingdoms like the Zulu reshaped the entire region. Britain seized the Cape Colony permanently in 1806, and the following century brought a near-constant sequence of colonial wars: the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, the dispossession of Xhosa and other peoples from their land, and finally the brutal South African War of 1899 to 1902, fought between the British and the descendants of the original Dutch settlers, known as Afrikaners or Boers, over control of the region's territory and, increasingly, its mineral wealth. Yes, this is the part the title promised, and it starts with 2 discoveries that changed everything. Diamonds were found near Kimberley in 1867, and gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886, triggering a wave of foreign investment and mass immigration, predominantly from Europe, and transforming South Africa almost overnight from a colonial backwater into one of the most economically significant territories on the continent. That mineral wealth also intensified the forced displacement of Black African labor into mining regions, establishing patterns of migrant labor and racial economic hierarchy that would, within a few decades, harden into formal government policy. The Union of South Africa formed in 1910, joining British and Afrikaner-controlled territories under a single government, one that, from the very beginning, excluded the Black African majority from full political participation. That exclusion escalated dramatically in 1948, when the National Party came to power and formally instituted apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness, a comprehensive legal system designed to separate South Africans by race in nearly every aspect of daily life. Here is where the armchair daydream becomes a spreadsheet, and where the numbers behind that system need to be stated plainly. The apartheid government passed over 100 laws enforcing racial segregation. The Population Registration Act of 1950 legally classified every South African as white, Black African, colored, or later, Indian or Asian. And that single classification determined where a person could live, what schools they could attend, what jobs they could hold, and whether they could vote at all. More than 3.5 million Black South Africans were forcibly relocated to arbitrary rural reservations called Bantustans, stripped of political power and pushed into poverty, while a series of land acts left white South Africans, roughly 10% of the population, controlling close to 90% of the country's land by the end of apartheid. Resistance to that system was sustained, and at times met with lethal force. In 1960, apartheid police opened fire on a peaceful protest against pass laws in Sharpeville, killing 69 people and injuring far more, drawing international condemnation and marking a turning point in global awareness of the regime. In 1976, Police killed hundreds of Soweto students protesting the forced use of Afrikaans in black schools, an event that reshaped both domestic resistance and South Africa's international reputation for the following 2 decades. Nelson Mandela, a central figure in the African National Congress's resistance movement, was imprisoned for 27 years. Released in 1990, as international sanctions and internal unrest finally forced the apartheid government to negotiate its own end. The international response to apartheid became one of the most sustained global solidarity movements of the 20th century. Sporting boycotts barred South African teams from international competition for decades. Cultural boycotts discouraged musicians and artists from performing in the country. And economic sanctions from major trading partners steadily squeezed an economy that had, for decades, benefited enormously from cheap, disenfranchised labor. By the mid-1980s, South Africa had become one of the world's genuine pariah states. And that isolation, combined with escalating internal unrest that the government could no longer fully contain through force, is widely credited by historians as a major factor pushing the National Party toward the negotiating table rather than continuing to govern through pure repression indefinitely. But here is the pivot, because the full picture matters more than the headline oppression. In 1994, South Africa held its first fully democratic multiracial elections, and Nelson Mandela was elected the country's first black president in a transition widely celebrated at the time as a triumph of negotiated reconciliation over what many had feared would become full-scale civil war. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission that followed, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, attempted something genuinely unusual in modern political history, publicly documenting apartheid-era human rights violations in exchange for amnesty, rather than pursuing purely punitive justice, a model other post-conflict societies have studied closely ever since. If you have made it this far, and you are watching a difficult, layered story like this one, a like and a subscribe genuinely help more people see the fuller picture. Let's talk numbers, because 3 decades of democracy have produced a genuinely mixed economic record. South Africa's GDP sits at roughly $480 billion nominally, making it one of the largest economies on the continent, with GDP per capita landing around $7,500 nominal and closer to $16,700 when adjusted for purchasing power. But sitting directly underneath those aggregate figures are some of the starkest inequality statistics of any country on Earth. South Africa's Gini coefficient, the standard measure of income inequality, sits at roughly 63, among the highest ever recorded for any nation, meaning the gap between the wealthiest and poorest South Africans remains staggering even after decades of policy explicitly designed to close it. Unemployment sits above 31% as of recent data, with youth unemployment climbing past 57%, numbers that would be considered a national emergency in most wealthy countries, and that here have persisted stubbornly for years. Here is a fact that says more about a whole country's recent struggles than almost anything else. South Africa's electricity grid, once one of the most reliable on the continent, deteriorated so severely over roughly 15 years of underinvestment and mismanagement at the state power utility that the government formally declared a national disaster over electricity supply in early 2023. Rolling blackouts, locally known as load shedding, became a routine, scheduled part of daily life for households and businesses alike. And while supply has stabilized somewhat since, the episode became a widely cited symbol of broader concerns about the state's capacity to maintain critical infrastructure 3 decades after apartheid ended. No honest account of modern South Africa can skip its harder edges. Crime, particularly violent crime, remains a persistent and widely discussed concern, with South Africa recording some of the highest rates of violent crime among middle-income nations globally. HIV and AIDS shaped South African mortality and public health policy for 2 full decades, and the country still carries one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world, even as treatment access has improved dramatically since the early 2000s. And spatial segregation from the apartheid era, townships deliberately built far from city centers and economic opportunity, has proven remarkably difficult to undo, with urban planning and zoning patterns still, in many cities, reflecting decisions made under a government that no longer exists. And yet, alongside all of that, South Africa holds some of the most extraordinary natural and cultural assets on the entire continent. The Cape Floristic region alone contains nearly 9,000 plant species, a level of botanical diversity packed into a relatively small area that rivals or exceeds far larger ecosystems elsewhere in the world. The country produces roughly 70% of the world's platinum, alongside major gold, chromium, and diamond output that still anchors a significant share of the national economy. Kruger National Park remains one of the premier wildlife destinations on Earth, home to the Big Five game animals across a protected area roughly the size of a small country in its own right. And sport carries genuine national weight here. The Springboks, South Africa's national rugby team, have won the Rugby World Cup 4 times, a record shared with no other nation, and rugby victories have, at key moments in the country's post-apartheid history, functioned as rare unifying national moments across racial and political lines that otherwise remain sharply divided. Daily culture reflects that same layered complexity. Braai, South African barbecue, functions as a genuine social institution cutting across communities, treated with a seriousness and ritual similar to how other cultures treat shared holiday meals. Music genres like amapiano, born out of South African townships in the 2010s, have grown into a genuine global cultural export, streamed and sampled by artists worldwide. And South African cuisine itself reflects the country's layered immigration history. Cape Malay cooking, brought by enslaved people from Southeast Asia during the Dutch colonial period, remains a distinct and celebrated culinary tradition centered in Cape Town today. A reminder that even the food on a South African table carries centuries of complicated history behind it. Religion here also reflects that layering. Christianity, introduced through both European colonization and independent African church movements, remains the dominant faith practiced by the large majority of South Africans. But it coexists, often within the same communities and even the same families, with traditional African spiritual practices centered on ancestor veneration. A blending rather than a strict either-or, with traditional healers, known as sangomas, still consulted alongside or in combination with modern medical care across large parts of the country. Islam and Hinduism, brought largely through the Indian and Cape Malay communities, add further layers to a religious landscape considerably more diverse than outside visitors typically expect walking in. For anyone actually planning to visit, Cape Town rewards travelers willing to look past Table Mountain and the waterfront toward the city's full historical layers, including the District 6 Museum, documenting a multiracial neighborhood forcibly demolished under apartheid's Group Areas Act. Johannesburg's Apartheid Museum offers one of the most comprehensive, unflinching accounts of the system's mechanics anywhere in the country. And Soweto, once a symbol of resistance, today mixes historical significance with a genuinely vibrant contemporary food and music scene. Kruger National Park and the surrounding private reserves remain the benchmark safari experience on the continent. And the Cape Winelands, built on a wine industry with roots stretching back to the earliest Dutch settlement, offer some of the finest wine tourism anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere. Responsible township tours, run by and genuinely benefiting local guides and communities rather than treating poverty as a spectacle, remain one of the more meaningful ways for visitors to actually engage with the country's post-apartheid reality rather than simply observing it from a distance. So here is the mirror. South Africa holds some of the oldest evidence of human existence anywhere on the planet, was colonized, fought over, and mined for its mineral wealth across 4 centuries, built one of the most comprehensive systems of legal racial separation in modern history, and dismantled that system through negotiation rather than civil war, emerging as one of the more closely watched constitutional democracies on the continent. It's a country that is genuinely beautiful in its landscape and wildlife, and genuinely difficult in its persistent inequality, genuinely reconciled at the level of formal politics, and genuinely still divided along lines apartheid drew decades ago, genuinely proud of what the 1994 transition achieved, and genuinely honest, at least among many of its own citizens, about how much of that transition's promise remains unfinished. Maybe the real question isn't what tourists never see in South Africa. It's whether a country this historically layered could ever be fully captured by any single visit at all. If you learned something here, that's what this channel is for. Like the video, drop a comment with what surprised you most, and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. There's a lot more of the world worth actually understanding.